On today's podcast,
I think the number one issue for Raleigh is just to secure Raleigh. And if we're going to do that, we got to do something different. We've been doing the same old, same old.
the truth is, adding value will never go out of style. Hello, and thanks for joining us for another Five Things podcast. Joining us today is Terrance Ruth, running for mayor of Raleigh, North Carolina. Thanks for joining us, Terrance.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm going to apologize in advance for my voice is a little raspy. It was the Hurricanes game last night, so it was one of the great comebacks in Hurricanes history. It was pretty awesome.
Wow, I didn't know it.
Yeah, it was awesome. We were losing 3-0 and going into the second. And anyway, follow the Canes on Twitter. You can figure out what's going on, or X, excuse me. But thanks for joining us today. That's not the reason for the podcast. Obviously, you're running for mayor.
Yes.
This conversation started. We had a friend introduce us,
right.
Former police officer.
That's right.
Now turned insurance agent. And he thought it would be a good idea for us to get together. We had a great lunch.
Yes.
We sat down, and it's like we were brothers from another mother.
Right,
We just yapped for about an hour straight.
That is true.
And it was a real pleasure getting to know you.
Yep.
And so we thought it'd be a good idea to obviously jump on the podcast. And full disclosure, I've done another podcast with Paul Fitz. And he did ask me to ask you while you're here. He would love to sit down with you and in a perfect world kind of sit down and go over some issues on video, of course, because there's what I find is there's not necessarily always one way or the other as far as right. There's degrees of getting to the same location sometimes. So there's lots of different ways to drive to Phoenix, Arizona from here. But that's the value of sitting down and having a discussion and discussions like this. So we were kind of joking around. I think we're going to have a great conversation because we have before, but hopefully we find some stuff to disagree with.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with disagreeing.
I agree.
You might love mushrooms. I think they're nasty.
Yeah.
And that's okay. So tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how you got to this point.
Yeah. So I'm one of six. My mother's side of the family has a deep-rooted history in Raleigh and Cary. Actually, my great uncle was raised here, Raleigh, Cary. So we still have a family house. They had to sell the one in Raleigh, but the one in Cary they still have. And I have one living member from my mother's side that's still here in the area. However, my grandmother and her mother, my great-grandmother, moved up north for day labor. So my earliest memory of my mother's side of the family is New Jersey. Okay. So she went up north, and she pulled a kid up at a time, which was normal back then. But I can't imagine now leaving my son and like paying for him to come up to me. But at the time, it was what you do. Sure. And so I have family in New Jersey now that has sort of a result of that. And then my father grew up in Southern Pines. Still there. They never left, but my father left home early. Okay. He came from Raleigh to Raleigh very early in his life. He left home around 15, 16. So my story is really a military story. My father was in the Navy, my mom was in the Army, and I was born on a military base in San Antonio. So we actually lived all over the place. Okay. My father was stationed in Orlando, so I have very deep history and meaning around Central Florida. Okay. So my PhD is from the University of Central Florida. Went to school in Miami at Nova Southeastern, and then my bachelor's is in Atlanta. But Florida has played a significant role as I've grown, but really I've lived all over. Okay. Well, I mean, it sounds like you come from a very diverse background to where you're learning a lot of different things. And I think there's, what is something that you take away from growing up in different areas and moving around? What is something you think there were some positives from that? Well, what you learn very quickly is how important community is to arriving and being welcome. And some people don't think that when you move to a city, there's a way that city welcomes you. And it may be formal or informal, but there's a way that community, that city welcomes you. And so I've had the chance to actually experience various forms of that, both up north and in the South. I've had a chance to enter new schools, exit new schools, enter community cultures and exit community cultures. But for me, there's a way in which you're welcome into community that have a lasting impression on you. Yeah, it's there's definitely I find areas seem to have a cultural kind of
essence, if you will, kind of an energy.
That's right.
And obviously Wolfpack had a great year.
Yeah, I was impressed with the men. If you follow the women's basketball team, they always operate in excellence.
They're always crushing.
Yeah, they're always. But it was amazing to have both the men and the women there. And I teach masters in social work. I teach research evaluation, policy, several different courses in the master's area. But undergraduate, I teach African American leadership. And in that class, I had one of the students that played on the men's team. And so he wrote me an email. He was like, Dr. Professor, can I get an extension on this assignment? We're in the Final Four. I was like, yeah.
That's reasonable. That's reasonable. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, so I've been there for about 9 years.
Awesome. Yeah. What, let me ask you this, just kind of jumping into stuff. What kind of drives you to go after something like this? Because I think when you put yourself out there, you know, you're really opening yourself up to get pot shots and all this kind of stuff. And it's unfortunate that that's the world we live in, that when you put yourself out there like that, you just know there's a certain amount of garbage that's going to come with it. What's driving you to make a move like this?
One, I think that we, as a culture, only tell the highlights of leaders that we celebrate. Their story is actually really nasty. People have really taken a blow at some of the leaders in our history. We talk about those who have died, but even the ones who have lived, it was a rough journey. We only celebrate their victories. We don't talk about the struggle. There's terms that weren't even used back then, like mental health and anxiety, that we don't even have a language for to talk about. And so I think that if you tell the story well of leaders that we celebrate in our rich American history, it's a really tough story. So when you sign up and you understand history, you know that's a part of the journey. But I grew up in a religious tradition. Ever since I was little, my mother was sort of like the faith leader of our house. Where we were always out in community. Community was a part of our journey. I don't remember ever being secluded and not engaging community directly. So I always had a heart and a compassion for being a part of community, but also contributing to. So my earliest, my mom makes fun of me. When I was young, I started a program called Our Futures, Our Fathers, Our Family. And it was a response to seeing a lot of families without fathers. And one Thanksgiving, I wanted to make 100 sweet potato pies to give out to all the families in underserved communities. But she was the one making the pies. And so we talk about that story all the time, because even when I was 20, 21, I was trying to figure out how do I give back, even if it's in the form of a pie.
Sure. How
do I give back to community? So it's been a part of my story since I can remember. I don't remember ever not seeing myself as an external figure contributing to community. But more and more as this country matures, you're seeing more isolation in individual pursuits. Even people who don't understand the connection that they have to community and their obligation to community. So I see this journey as an obligation.
Okay.
To get back to community.
Okay. Well, I think that's good. And I think, I don't know, kind of random here, but I believe one of the reasons why I'm a pretty good business owner is because one of my love languages is acts of service. That's one of my main ones. So, you know, when I can look back and look at the military, for example, and then look at being self-employed and being just relentless, providing relentless service for customers and really trying to do your best. I do believe that's a way of loving your fellow human being is try to serve them like that.
That's right.
You know, it's interesting. Have you ever taken the 5 love languages test or anything?
I have.
Okay.
I have.
Right.
And mine is similar to yours.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We share that.
Well, it's kind of interesting. But let me ask you this, kind of a 50,000-foot view. What do you see the role? What are like the primary roles of government that you see?
Yeah, so I think government does one part, which is protection. And most people think about military might or law enforcement. But I think there's some level of protections that's much broader than that. So I said my campaign primary focus is security. Security for the resident. What will make you feel secure? And so for me, we have housing insecurity, we have food insecurity, we have economic insecurity, small business support. I mean, we can go down the levels of security that a government touches. But if you zoom into local level, it's providing security to residents, no matter where you are on the spectrum, no matter where you live in the city or the state. And I think that there's a book called The Tools of Governance, and they call it like the Bible of government tools. That book begins and ends. So that means there's a finite set of tools. It's the combination of those tools that allow for you to address those securities and insecurities. And so for me, I think that's the primary focus, to make sure that all residents feel secure.
And I like that. I think a government's job is to protect the public, from foreign invaders or domestic situations or what have you. Or I just watched a thing on Theodore Roosevelt, a 2-part series, which was really good. And like back then in the early 1900s, there was, big business was kind of out of control. And there were lots of good things that he implemented. And it was tough on business back then because they were so abusive to their laborers. They were so abusive to the food, just the way it was packed, and rats, and like it wasn't clean. And, so in that role, government's moving in, and it's, I don't want to say oppressing, that's not the right word, but it's really setting up regulations on business, which is a negative to the business, but it's a positive to the community. And it's really things that needed to be done. And in hindsight, it was common sense, right? But I believe that it's easy to get cynical about government. I think the government's out of control in a lot of different areas, or I should say, in control. But out of whack right now. I just think that there's a place for government to get involved with business and society. And there's a balance, there's that balance. And I do believe, generally speaking, mainly federally, that the government is way too powerful right now, way too involved. And I mean, that's probably a whole podcast in itself, but
there's a course on that.
But when it comes to local politics, protecting the public is number one, obviously. And it sounds like you and Paul, for example, are on the same page with that. It's, you got to have law enforcement, you got to have training for those guys, but you got to have, a lot of other things in place to make sure the public is safe overall.
Yeah, I mean, what's unfortunate is that by the time an officer is called, you're talking about a spectrum of safety that has been ignored. There are things you can put in place that can resolve issues before it ever require a 911 call, before it even requires an officer to show up. And I think we ignore what can be put in place prior to law enforcement, and that's safety too. But we have put a lot on officers that could be prevented if you see safety in a much broader sense. And so I think that there are things that we can do locally to broaden that definition, which will be harder federally to do. But locally, we can broaden the definition of safety so that it allows for officers to have a place in that role, but not have to dominate the narrative of that role, because responsibility is shared by all on safety.
Sure. And that makes sense. And again, we've got a lot of folks with mental health issues and things like that, that unfortunately the cops are on the front line of that, and they're going to catch a bunch of flack because they're thrown into these really tough situations. And it's unfortunate, but if you're a cop and you make a hair trigger decision and it was maybe an accurate one, or one that you didn't see it clearly or something like that, I mean, you get yourself in a bad spot as a cop. So I empathize with those guys. And there are certain people that don't have the temperament to be a cop. And so that's where, like, going back to like 2020, which is part of what I want to talk about here in a little bit, because I don't really have a lot of opinion about Marianne Baldwin. The things that I do have opinions about are not really positive. Primarily because of 2020. But I'm a big proponent of local government being strong. When we see the Mitch McConnells and the Pelosi's and those folks are so far out of touch. I like the fact that you can walk in and see the mayor sitting there having dinner or lunch at Stir with some dude.
That's right. That's right.
You know, and you got folks that are in the community, and I just think I think we get better servants from local people because you're in their face and they're in your face. Yeah. And everybody's going to call while we're doing the podcast. So thought I'd turn that off. But that's why I'm a big proponent of smaller federal government, and it is obviously the number one employer in the world is federal government, and it's just it's a self-serving machine in my opinion right now. But I don't want to get into that. It's not why we're here. So what are something that bringing up Mary Ann Baldwin? What is something that you thought she did well?
For one, I think she put in place policies that will allow for us to be more flexible around housing types.
Okay.
That didn't exist prior. So like ADUs was introduced prior to her, but she's landed that plane. Okay. Missing middle, that's you could give that to her. There's things she could have done around missing middle to make sure that it's actually producing affordable housing, but it still provides housing types that didn't exist before in our zoning. Also, I think that she did a good job of allowing for the policy to be open enough so that we can be more creative in how we interpret that policy towards the local issue that we have. And so to me, I think the interpretation still needs some work, but the tool is now on the table that wasn't there before.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to pretend to know a whole lot about any of that, but that's the thing. It's like it's easy, and I'm guilty as charged. Yeah. It's easy to get caught up in high level things that make the press and things like that. But things that impact us locally, that impact us directly, I would say a lot of people are ignorant. I follow this stuff kind of closely. I think Julie would probably agree. But I follow it pretty closely. But I don't know about a lot of the stuff. And these are the reasons why it's good for people like yourself that are running for office to have the platform. What is something you would say that, trying not to be negative here, but saying she did not do a great job or you would have done differently, let's say? Yeah,
so let's just go back to those policies. We saw or was able to forecast the housing crisis years ago. These tools, so policy gives you permission. Mm-hmm. How you implement that policy gives you direction.
Sure.
And we didn't give it direction. And so we have the tool, but we can't tell you how many units are affordable now because of the tool. We can't tell you how many human beings are in those units that are affordable. We can't tell you the number that we need to reach in order to, there's a lot of unknowns that should be known to the taxpayer.
Right.
And right now, a lot of those numbers are unknown. And a lot of the numbers are, we had to vote on this policy. As a people, we had to vote on affordable housing bond was introduced during that time. So if we voted on the bond and we approved the missing middle, we should receive some feedback as to how that is going, because it costs money. Money's being spent as this is happening. The communication has been the Achilles heel since 2019. The relationship between the community and the city seemed to have just disappeared. So there was a series of events. First, there was a historical organization called the Community CACs, Community Advisory Council.
Okay.
CACs. It was birthed in the 1960s, 70s. It was designed to give platform to community voices around the city rather than just having to come to the council meeting. Ideally, it was a very diverse group. It was started by the first Black mayor, Terrance Ruth. Over time, it has become a voice that allows for you to dominate zoning decisions according to the former administration or the current mayor. With that, there was, over those times, since 1970, there had been a level of trust in that institution of CACs that once you delete it, you lose it. And anybody that have managed a large organization know that you either got to pivot slowly or you got to have a strategy for what happens when this void is gone. And when the decision was made in 2019, 2020 to get rid of the CACs, it's almost as if we had someone who wasn't used to making that large of a decision because there was a void. That void resulted in a recall campaign for the mayor, which we haven't seen in years. Most people didn't even know the mayor existed for years. We also witnessed where we spent $75,000 to $100,000 for a consultant. And after that tenure was over, we still didn't have a replacement for the city. Now, we're talking about years are going by. We then paid for a whole department around community engagement to be created, which almost quadrupled the price of the CAC. So, I mean, you're making decisions now that's just costing dollars without meaningful outcome.
Sure.
And so, to me, a decision like that, you have to understand the SWOT analysis on what it means to implement and roll out, or at least dissolve an institution like that.
You know, one of my I guess cynical things I think about with government was and again, this is a state thing, but you know, California came up with a program and budget to eliminate homelessness. And I hope I'm not misquoting that. I want to say they've spent $24 billion and they've got the homeless problem. It's the most homeless. And you got bureaucrats that are making $250,000 a year. I just think about this as a business owner. And I think about this, whether it's, I'll take that back. I'm not going to go down that path. When I think about that guy that's making $250,000 a year, does he really want to solve homelessness? Because he puts himself out of work. And that's where those are the type of things where it makes me think. I just think that sometimes the private industry's far more solution oriented when it comes to a lot of that kind of stuff. You know, if we just maybe had less taxes and more incentives as people. Like, for example, if we talk about switching gears just a tad, but like everybody deserves health care. Just give us a tax credit. Why do we need the government to get involved? If a government really wants to pay for our health care, just give it back to us in our taxes. Just straight up. There's no bureaucracy. I mean, we spent $2 billion on the Obamacare website. $2 billion for a website. That was one little piece of the whole thing. So we're going to leave off on sometimes government's part of the solution, sometimes another department's created.
So my PhD is in public affairs, and they literally teach you so you take 2 years of courses and then you do your dissertation. That first 2 years, they're just telling you how government operates, the tools, the limitations, when to do public-private partnerships, when to not involve the government, when to just do a public service announcement. Like, it tells you all the different tools. And one of the things I've learned from those 2 years is that policy has great candidate political office intentions. People come in, they have great intentions. And they normally campaign on those intentions. But usually where policy wins or fails is in implementation. And that's the hardest thing to do.
Sure.
And most people don't even, actually the customer very rarely follows a policy to implementation. Unless it's like healthcare where you can see it immediately and you need it right now. But very rarely do you get to follow that policy to its conclusion and say, this wasn't implemented well. We sort of wasted here. You only see it in major issues. But implementation is critical. And what I found is very few entities or leaders know how to land the plane well. And for me, I don't want campaigns to live off of intentions. I want to solve affordable housing, so I want to do the missing middle. That's wonderful. 2 years from now, let's do an evaluation to see if you are actually producing. So what I teach at NC State is evaluation, policy evaluation. Walk that thing through. Evaluation starts at the beginning of policy. At the beginning of policy, you set out where we should be at phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4.
Essentially, you're laying out the goals.
Yes.
And then you're doing after action reviews to see, hey, either we're on target or we're off target. What are we missing?
Yes, and we have a weak mayor structure. So it's almost like I'm just a board chair of a board versus like New York where you're like a CEO. But that doesn't mean you don't have to be an executive. It doesn't mean that if you with your company, if you need to pivot.
Right.
Why not? We need to pivot. Right now, we're losing money with this customer base. We need to pivot. You could do the same thing with policy. You have amazing data analysts that works for the city. You have amazing community engagement specialists who can give you the touch of the town, who's doing what. Have a weekly session where you talk to the city. Give them the update on the policy.
You know, one of the things I always said if I ran for office is I would have, obviously you got Twitter and things like that, but I would have my own website, and any decision that I was involved in or had to make, because, you know, God knows you guys got to make a lot of tough decisions, right? And it's a lot of times it's well, and again, coming back to federal stuff, it's like, well, I don't want to vote for this bill because of A, B, and C, but I know that there's veterans benefits in here that I'm going to get, you know, crucified over, that I'm not supporting veterans, you know, but just so people can see where you're coming from and say, you know what, I like these 8 things, but these 14 things were bad, so I had to say no.
That's right. That's right.
You know, and back to the drawing board and back to the negotiations and trying to get everybody some consensus. But obviously X gives a great platform to get that kind of stuff out as well. But
I agree.
It would be great to have a website, and I would encourage anybody run for office, just have a website with all of your legacy interviews. And the other thing too, and again, I don't care what political party you're affiliated with, I would love to see some leaders say, you know what, we got that one wrong.
Yes.
And I got that decision wrong. I regret it. I can't change it, but here's what I would do differently. Here's what I'm going to, you know, and it's just, folks can't just own their mistakes, you know?
Good. And the reason why I'm almost infatuated with local government is because a mayor's seat is unaffiliated. I have to talk to everybody. Mm-hmm. I don't have the luxury of like staying in a cubby hole or night. I have to literally talk to everybody. Mm-hmm. And we have some very divisive issues going on right now across college campuses, across foreign affairs. I mean, literally, you can pick it, and it's very divisive. I mean, I got
a couple of them written down here. So.
Like very divisive. So for me, I don't have the luxury of just pitching my tent on one side or the other. As a mayor, you got to talk to everybody, which means a site like that would be meaningful to show people how you process that policy.
Right.
That processing will give you a glimpse into my leadership. It'll give you a glimpse into how I evaluate priorities.
You're thinking about it.
Yes.
And I think most people, we kind of joke about it with customers, like 1% to 2% of our customers will wear us out. But like 90% of the people are pretty reasonable.
That's right. That's right.
And I think that most people are in the middle. Yep. You know, you got how I see it is you got 10 to 15 on the far left, 10 to 15 on the far right. Most of us, I'd say, are, you know, 70 to 80%. We're kind of in the middle.
That's right.
We're going to agree on most stuff we talk about.
That's right.
But it's good to communicate, obviously. And you're a great communicator. I mean, it's easy to sit down and talk to you, and you're also a person that can agree to disagree. Yeah. You know, it's like, well, I got to make this decision. It's a tough one, and this is where I'm going with for now. Yeah. Speaking of which, one of the things that does drive me a little batty, coming back to protesting, one of the things I didn't like is, you know, how the riots were handled. You know, we've got a client that their place was demolished. Yeah. You know, alarms going off. We dispatched the police. Nobody's showing up. Yeah. You know, so from my perspective and from plenty of people's perspective, it feels like they just were told to stand down, let them destroy the city. We know that there was a lot of people that came from out of town. Yep. We know that there was a pallet of bricks delivered downtown. You know, my thing is, why aren't we researching? And I'm sure there's a lot of people that know where those bricks came from. Someone paid for them. Yeah. Someone was aided and abetted a riot that created a lot of destruction, and there's no accountability for that. No. And maybe that's the mayor's kind of an area of expertise. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But if I were the mayor, I feel like I would have done some things differently in terms of protecting the public. Coming back to what we talked about, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So first, if you go back to 2020, that's the season in which people were asking me, "Hey, we need leadership that's present." Mm-hmm. Community was asking for present leadership. Mm-hmm. If you remember about around 2020, there were local leaders around the country that shined because they were present. They were either on live chat talking through difficult issues. They were either on the street trying to lead. They were either making pleads and they were visible. We didn't have that here.
Okay.
And so decisions were made, but you don't know where the decisions came from. You don't know how they landed. So in times where things are tense, you need the most social capital and you need the most communication.
Nailed it. Yeah.
If anything, you need to build that capital during peace. If anything, you need to build that up so that you can use it during times when it's intense. And we didn't have it to use, and we didn't use it during the times in which community was needed the most. I know several organizations that do peaceful protests all the time. They even felt that they were in an arena where there were people they never saw before. Every year for about 20 years, we've had in February a protest called it's really a march called HK and it's just people come and say, hey, we need this in our community. It's almost like a policy request from a large community. 100,000 people will show up downtown. Balloons, family event. These are the people who organized during that time, and they were sitting down peaceful. They have a peaceful framework. That's not what you saw during that time. The people who actually do this for a living and engage and have meaningful relationships with policymakers, that audience know how to engage and put pressure on leaders without destroying.
Which is the right kind of pressure.
Yes, but that's not what we saw that time. And so it required leadership to be present and voice the distinction between the two.
Let me ask you this, and I'm just thinking of a situation in Durham recently. Obviously, you're not running for Durham, but the Gaza protesters out there blocking the freeway. My thing is this, without taking a side, I'm all for people protesting and people are passionate about lots of topics. You don't get to block the roads.
No.
What are your thoughts on that? Because obviously it aggravates me.
Yeah, so I know for a while they have been reaching out to meet with local leaders. So this actually has probably been about 3 or 4 months before anything. Most of the cities who responded, they didn't see any, like Raleigh didn't see a street blocked. Most of the cities didn't see. Durham internally were negotiating how they're going to respond. Okay. And Durham has a different mixture. Durham has an activist base in their community. So they'll protest certain things that you wouldn't see in Raleigh.
Sure.
Or Cary.
And I think most Americans protest your heart's desire. Stay out of the road. You got a single mom trying to feed her kids with inflation going crazy, and you're blocking the roads. And aren't we concerned about climate change? We got cars sitting there idling. So I think there needs to be things done about people in the roads. I think it's a formula for there's going to be somebody that snaps and pulls out a weapon and just cleans the road. And let's not let that happen.
And I think, I believe, and it's not a solution for everything because some things are unpredictable, but I do believe that you can engage in dialogue with groups that don't have to be public, that will allow for you to come to at least a compromise or a conclusion. This group is a little different with this group, but I'm saying you come to a compromise and a position prior to any direct action. And usually direct action is a response to not being able to communicate with those in leadership and power.
Well, I can see that. I can see where there's frustration that grows. That makes a lot of sense to me. That's the whole thing with the censorship. We're jumping topics here, but like with censorship, when you censor people, I know some of my social media has been suppressed because I actually had data on COVID, for example. And I'm not going to talk too much about that because I don't want the podcast censored on YouTube. But at the end of the day, it's like if you censor people, all that's going to, in my opinion, that's going to build that resentment that you're talking about. And there's a part of, maybe it's an alpha male thing, but there's a part of me, it's like, you're going to hear me. You know what I mean? It's like at some point, if I'm frustrated enough, I'm going to make you hear me. And I could see your point there. If you have open dialogue and you're willing to sit down with folks, let's have these conversations like, hey, I'm the mayor of Raleigh. I understand you're frustrated. I don't have anything to do with Gaza. Like or Israel or, fill in the blank.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a tough situation in a lot of those things, but I just think they're when I see the way Florida was handling the people in the roads, like they just cuffed them, get them off the roads.
Yeah.
I would like to see more of that, and create a way that people can voice their disgust with Israel or Gaza or whatever side of the topic you're on. I just think if people need that channeled event, and we got to have people out of the roads.
And I was a part. So I want to touch on two parts because you're in a great topic here. One, I'm gonna tell you about an example where it was done well in terms of engaging people who are in the streets. And then the second piece, I want to talk about critical thinking, which you're touching on. That I think is, I think democracy don't exist if you don't.
You got to have critical thinking. If you're going to be successful at anything.
I don't think democracy exists if you delete that. And you can't have critical thinking if there's only one side talking.
Right.
But Poor People's Campaign 2017-18 was being recreated by Dr. Barber, and it was in D.C. Everybody was going to D.C. to talk about issues of poverty. Mm-hmm. The protests happened in the streets in D.C., right? The main street that goes around all the major hubs. There was a conversation with law enforcement. They had bright pink hand straps. It was burning up hot, by the way. It was like 100, it was like 100-something degrees. Cold water. People, they already knew what the plan was if they went forward. There's no way anything violent could have sparked from this event. It was well crafted. Well, I mean, it was beautiful. I mean, literally, if you had to like put a playbook to it. And I don't know, I wasn't in the dialogue with the law enforcement, but whoever planned it for the Capitol
They were thoughtful.
It was thoughtful. It was kind. It was efficient. It was quick. And even the wraps were pink. I mean, like, I don't know how, I don't know what you, but it was a brilliant plan.
It sounded organized.
Yes.
I don't know much about that situation.
Yes. But it was just well done without allowing any outliers to influence the mode or the mood or the nonviolent nature of the protest.
Well, I do believe there's instigators with a variety of, for example, obviously George Floyd protest. I believe there were instigators there that were bad actors that maybe hijacked some of that stuff. I would say the same thing about January 6th. I would say that, we're naive to think that there aren't forces that want to divide us.
Yeah, that's good.
And no matter which side of the political aisle you're on, you have to, and I hope you don't mind, I'll just share I don't believe in Republicans or Democrats anymore. I believe in establishment versus people trying to help citizens.
Yeah.
The more data that I get, coming back to critical thinking, Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi to me are the same person.
Yeah.
And so I think Mitt Romney and Obama are the same person. There's maybe a little different flavor, but ultimately I think you would have got the same thing either way. And I think we have to understand that when I say they, let's just say the outside forces that aren't interested in a strong United States.
Yeah.
That's what I mean with they.
Yeah.
And I believe there's a lot of they.
Yeah.
Whether you're talking about China or World Economic Forum or lots of influences. I think the best thing we can do is talk to each other and find out that you're for something, I'm not for something. And like one of the things I want to bring up here in a second is the whole student debt thing. When we talk to each other, we could probably come up with some solutions pretty simply. And I think that's why they censor, in part because they don't want people to have that common sense rebuttal to something that's being shoved down our throats. But in any case.
Noam Chomsky, he evaluates archives in the federal government. He's probably the most quoted human being alive. I believe that's accurate. He always show that there's a similar thread between party leaders, and he normally evaluates presidents. He said, you don't really get too many outliers.
Crazy outliers. Yeah.
And he only talks about outcomes, and he talks about American polling. When you poll, we normally have a good chunk that polls the same. It's not talking about party. It's talking about how you feel about certain issues. Normally that poll is a good majority of people. And then he evaluates the evolution of media. So he has a lane, and it's called, the book he wrote it's called way before, this book is old. I mean, got to be early 90s. Manufactured Consent.
Okay.
Manufactured consent. So he talks about how you should consume information outside of the major media outlets, so that you can understand, or at least come closer to where most people are.
Sure.
And then he evaluates all presidents, and he's really critical of America. So he's not. He's pretty much raw. He's an MIT professor.
Okay.
Pretty raw. He's an expert in linguistics, but he's also an expert in sort of American foreign policy.
Okay.
The reason why I bring him up is because he would agree with you that most Americans are agreeing on certain issues. If you remove party, if you just poll, it polls above a majority. Even though our policy doesn't always follow that.
Sure.
That mold.
Special interest and lobbyists and
yes. Yeah, but he said if you strip it away, you would get that.
So we were talking about, we just took a little break there to check on the cameras. We were talking about Noam Chomsky and critical thinking, and he's raw in terms of, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's plenty of bad.
Yeah, he doesn't talk. He talks across parties. He doesn't just
Well, facts are facts,
That's
right?
That's right.
And I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and we were going back and forth. I'm not a fan of Biden, for the record. I mean, I don't know how anybody is. I mean, I think most people are not a fan of the other guy more than they're not a fan of Biden. But that being said, what was talking about? Oh, we're talking about debt, and that debt has been accrued over the last 25 years, basically through both parties. And when we're talking 34 trillion, we've overspent by $34 trillion. And this is where I think you get a lot of people that are like me, that are, I love my country, I love people, but I'm super cynical with government right now because they can't balance a checkbook. And coming back to what you're talking about, it's they're doing all of these things. We have trillions of dollars for endless wars, but we've got veterans suffering. We've got homeless problems. We've got mental health that's not being addressed. We've got so many things. We've got a border that's basically wide open, and who knows what's coming from that. There's all of these things that are going on, and it's like, why am I paying federal taxes here? It's like they have money for all these special. They got money for the military-industrial complex. They got money for pharma, foreign governments, and I think that I think a lot of people are really starting to get fed up with this. And that's why I'm a big fan of local government, because I think you're just a little bit more practical that, hey, guys, we got a budget to balance. We got to figure this out. We can't just make it rain and, print more cash.
And the research is showing, especially during this year, that the more local candidates associate with federal candidates, they lose voters. It's almost as if people are zoning into local and saying, this is where I want to put my attention. So voters are plugging into local, but the moment the local becomes a part of a larger federal sort of political campaign, people lose interest.
Interesting.
And so you're seeing where local is becoming the center focus. Now, will people turn out to vote? That's different. Interest, attention versus voting, that's two different. We have yet to see that change, where you see more people vote local than they vote. But at least the data is telling us that people aren't interested as much in the federal versus the local in terms of being interested in learning and hearing. It could be the divisive nature. It could be they don't have detail around why. They just know that that's the case.
Interesting. So we've talked about keeping the roads clear. We've talked about, I'm asking questions here. Is there something you want to bring up or something you want to chat about real quick? I got some more stuff, but I don't want to dominate the whole conversation.
I think that we have, to your point, in terms of people being frustrated with what they're seeing nationally, we have a generation that we're not talking about really they're not interested in democracy at all. There is a younger generation that don't care. It used to be, hey, we need you to register to vote. Then we need you to turn out and vote. Then we need you to be informed about who you're voting for. They went all the way back to step one and said, we're not even interested in registering. And they're voicing that. I mean, it's a confident no. And I think if we don't give them what you're talking about in local government, somebody that's practical, there's limited resources. We have to share it across parties. We have to share it across, we have to build community. If we do this well, I think we can convert some of these younger voters back into why democracy works, why it's important to be engaged, plug in, contribute to our earlier conversation. But unfortunately, we're seeing a trend where younger voters are opting out completely from voting.
Which is interesting, and you know, pain will change that.
Oh, that's good.
You know, pain will change that. So when there's enough pain, when there's enough, you know, you see people, and again, you can see things coming down the pipe.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's like the cost of living now was kind of easy to predict. We've been printing trillions of dollars of cash. We've been overspending like crazy. You know, taxes keep going up. It drives the cost of everything up when taxes go up. Yeah. You know, I'm sitting right here on my just random Equifax is charging me $500 a year to be able to have access to their services. That doesn't include what I pay to check someone's credit. And that's a new thing. Wow. You know, and you take that times 30, 40 things across a business.
That's right.
You know, meanwhile, I'm trying to give pay raises.
That's right.
I'm trying not to raise my customers' prices. And, you know, I think that's what a good mayor is probably like a good business owner, that you've got to balance so many different things and keep everybody kind of happy.
That's right.
You know, nobody's 100% happy. Nobody's getting everything they want.
That's right. But
you got to kind of like running an orchestra. You got to, that tuba player can't get too crazy. That's right. You know, the drummer can't go nuts back there. You got to keep everybody kind of in harmony, and that's the challenge.
That's right.
But I totally lost my point with what I was talking about. The benefits of getting old. But I think that's the challenge, is just trying to get folks involved, and they understand that you're part of the process. And
you were talking about pain.
Pain. That's right.
I remember.
That's right.
I remember. I was a freshman in college, and I remember my first moment where the country was in a shock, and it was 9/11. I was a freshman in college. I remember the world stopped. The world just stopped. But I remember,
everybody does. If you were there,
like if there was a meter for patriotism, it like shot out the roof.
Oh, everybody!
It went to the sky.
It's true.
And so, to your point, that pain
brought everybody together.
Nobody cared what you were; they were trying to get you out of the rubble.
Right.
They didn't care if you were. They were just trying to get you out of the rubble.
Right.
And to your point, that pain will force you to enter into, and I like that. I haven't heard that. That's a good, yeah.
Well, the other thing, and it's sad, but this is human nature. It's you know, we deal with it in the security industry. It's so many people are reactive to a bad scenario versus being proactive to avoid a bad scenario. And, you know, a lot of people are, you know, you put on too much weight, so you react to it versus being proactive. Maybe you're spending too much and you're not saving and investing enough. And then there's pain that causes you to change. And so maybe those folks just need to feel some pain before they get engaged and understand that you're part of the solution here. Yeah. Your lack of involvement. Yeah. Don't bellyache on Facebook about the cost of living if you're not engaged in the process.
Yeah. And again, who you vote for matters.
It does.
It matters in what happens to your taxes. It matters in what happens to your land use. It matters in what types of schools you have.
Property rights with squatters right now.
Yes.
You know, there's a lot of these type of things that it's baffling to me how someone can squat in your property and you can't get in your own property. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And I would love to see, I wish I could sit down with somebody that says that's okay. I don't understand where those type of people are coming from.
I remember Netflix created a documentary on squatters, and that's the first time I ever seen. They did worst case scenario, and the person he was just supposed to be a roommate, forced the person who owned the place out.
It's unbelievable.
So it was their place. They're paying for this place, and had to be. That's when I realized, oh, this is a problem.
And that's primarily a local issue, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So those are your local leaders that impact that situation.
I tell people all the time, most of the things we celebrate were local issues. When it became tense, you saw federal government intervene. Most of them were local issues. From how our public schools are to how we dealt with civil rights,
and segregation,
everything
JFK sending in the troops.
Was local. Everything was local. These characters were local. But we often think that the president was the end all be all to these events, and it's just not. And there was a separation of powers. There were certain things that the president had to try first, before bringing. But local is everything. Local touches everything. I know all of my school board members. Like I want to make sure that my son, who's in public school, is being served well. Most of the people who are active in their schools, they know the principal, but the principal is managing the restaurant. They know the owner of the restaurant, who hires the superintendent, and that's the school board.
Right.
They know the investment group.
Setting the values for the organization.
Yes. And most people don't. Most people don't know the school board member, but you're voting for that human being.
Right. Right. That makes sense. And their values.
Yes.
Well, I actually had a lot of other stuff, but I think we're running out of time here. But I'll tell you what. Is there anything you want to kind of maybe wrap up with here and just ultimately put out there what you think you bring to the table and what you'd like to do for the city of Raleigh?
Yeah, for me, I think the number one issue for Raleigh is just to secure Raleigh. And if we're going to do that, we got to do something different. We've been doing the same old. We've traditionally had leaders who have been invisible. The city is now ready for somebody that they can see, somebody that they can follow. And I bring that. That's something different that I bring. Not just a technical understanding of policy, but also a compassion for the human beings that will be impacted by that policy. That combination, I think, is unique to my journey. And so it's just TerranceRuth.com, TerranceRuth.com, and would love to answer any questions. I'm an open book for questions. I talk to anybody, and so please feel free to reach out.
Follow you. I know you're on. I just followed you on X.
That's
I
right.
know you're on Twitter or
I'm on
X, rather.
I'm
same
on
thing.
X. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook.
Okay.
Follow me on all.
Well, invest a little time and see what Terrance has got going on. I tell you, I like Paul Fitz a lot. I like you a lot. I mean, you're both. I would feel very comfortable with both of you guys, and I'm sure there's nuances and differences, and some people like the color red, some people like the color blue. It's okay. But I feel really grateful that we've got two, what I can tell are good, genuine human beings that just want to serve their community. So I'm very grateful, and thank you for coming in today. And I would happily drag you back on the podcast to cover some other stuff here in the future. Awesome. Thanks for your time, Terrance, and thanks for joining us for another 5 Things podcast. Hello, this is Brian Smith, and thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more valuable content.